The Masamune, the legendary sword that Sephiroth uses in the Final Fantasy VII series. Well, turns out there's a lot to it, and we're going to check out an interview today with Tetsuya Nomura where he dives into the organic nature of the sword and how it can control its own length, why they chose that weapon specifically for Sephiroth, and why it's a nice contrast between Sephiroth and Cloud, and so much more. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around, you can subscribe, and let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. So this interview comes to us from Polygon, who got to sit down with Tetsuya Nomura for, get this, Cool Sword Day, which, yes, is a real thing. I googled it. It exists. It is a day to celebrate cool swords. And what better sword to celebrate on Cool Sword Day than the Masamune and its wielder, Sephiroth. So in this interview, we're going to get a ton of information on the Masamune, its inception, why they chose it for Sephiroth, and even some cool stuff in regards to Ever Crisis in the First Soldier story arc, which is super cool. Starting off first, they ask Nomura why name Sephiroth's sword Masamune after the famous medieval blacksmith. Nomura goes on to say, the Masamune has appeared throughout the Final Fantasy series as the strongest sword. When thinking about equipping Sephiroth with a sword that is a worthy match for him, I figured there was no better option than Masamune. And that just makes sense. When you have a powerful weapon and you've now created a new villain in Sephiroth who becomes incredibly iconic, it would just make sense to be like, yeah, this is an incredible villain who is incredibly skilled. We gotta give him a sword that matches up with that. It just really makes sense. But what's also really cool is that Square Enix is currently putting a twist on the whole medieval blacksmith of Masamune story with Ever Crisis. So in the world of FF7, the blacksmith Masamune crafts the sword itself, names it after himself, but this is where things start to get a little bit weird. The sword has some sort of weird charm and pull to it, and it starts to drive people crazy. So the people within the village that the blacksmith is staying at are really lusting after this sword. They want it, they're willing to fight and kill each other for it. Even Masamune himself gets in on the action and is like, look, this is my precious, I can't let anyone have it. So he kills everyone in the village at night as they're sleeping, so that way he can keep the sword to himself and nobody else can get their hands on it. It's essentially driving him crazy and warping him and almost kind of turning him into some sort of weird creature. He's losing a lot of his humanity because of this weapon. And the running theory out there that some people have is perhaps this sword was crafted with a piece of the meteorite that contained Jenova, which would explain why it's driving people crazy. It's got some sort of weird, crazy aura and charm to it, but it would also explain why it has such a connection to Sephiroth, because when Sephiroth and crew get to the location where Masamune is, Sephiroth is immediately drawn to this weapon. He's fascinated by it, and he says, I need to have this thing, it's mine, it was meant for me. So if it was crafted with a piece of that meteorite, it would explain why Sephiroth has that connection to it and why he's so obsessed with getting his hands on it. But it's a really cool twist on the story of Masamune, and I do like that they're giving the Masamune a backstory, much like the Buster Sword, which Cloud uses, that has its own story of it being a weapon gifted to Angeal, which then got passed on to Zack, which he then passed on to Cloud. So there's a lineage there, and with Masamune, we're learning that there's a really twisted lineage with that, which I think is pretty nice. Now, the next question kind of gives me the idea that maybe the interviewer wasn't paying enough attention, because they ask, whose idea was it to give Sephiroth this specific type of sword rather than a Buster Sword, for example? And in the previous answer, Nomura pretty much says that I decided that he should have the Masamune. So I think that's just a little bit funny there. But Nomura politely goes on to say, that would be mine. Each time Cloud went through a tweak in design, the accompanying Buster Sword seemed to grow larger. Reason being, I thought the juxtaposition between Cloud wielding a giant sword and Sephiroth, who is far more powerful, wielding a skinny katana, would be quite interesting. Additionally, the contrast between a wide broadsword and a long Japanese katana is also inspired by the rivalry of two famous Japanese swordsmen, Musashi and Kojiro. This is cool. I like when they take elements of like actual mythical or even real life history and put their own twist on it. There was an interview done recently with Kazushige Nojima, who is the scenario writer for all of FF7, and he talked about how they like to take actual mythological stories or beasts and put their own twists on them for the world of FF7. And again, we're seeing that with the medieval twist on Masamune the blacksmith, and now this rivalry between Cloud and Sephiroth. But also, visually, it's just really striking. You have Sephiroth, who is this really tall, white-haired dude who's incredibly skilled, wielding a really long, skinny sword, and then you've got Cloud, who's a little bit shorter, maybe not as strong, who's wielding this gigantic buster sword. And normally when you look at movies or TV shows, it's usually the villain who ends up having the bigger weapon and not the hero, but them reversing it for this I think is pretty cool. But also that buster sword. If I can find images or video, I'll try to put it in this video, but looking at some of the earlier illustrations of Cloud, Nomura is right. The buster sword looked kind of like a regular broadsword at one point in time, but then it just got bigger and bigger and bigger until we ended up with the buster sword we know of today, which is incredibly iconic. And if there are two things from the Final Fantasy series that are iconic and have transcended pop culture media, it's the buster sword and Sephiroth. People who don't even play Final Fantasy or haven't even played FF7 in particular, they know who Sephiroth is and they know what the buster sword is, which is super cool. Also, obvious inappropriate jokes aside about length and girth, these have just become two incredibly cool, iconic weapons that everyone knows. Up next, they ask Nomura, with the length of Sephiroth's sword, did that make choreographing fight scenes or any of the gameplay stuff kind of hard to do? Nomura goes on to say, Sephiroth has appeared in many different titles before, and with each appearance, the length of his sword is adjusted based on the title's specifications. In other words, we didn't design the scene based on the length of the sword, but rather designed the length of the sword based on the game design. I have a rough guideline that his sword should be around 10 feet long, but this has never been consistent across any of his appearances, including Rebirth or any merchandise. Now, when it comes to gameplay, Sephiroth has been in Smash Brothers, he's been in Kingdom Hearts, he's been in Dissidia, he's also been in the legendary fighting game that everybody loves, Eargeese, God bless the ring by the way. And naturally, when you have gameplay mechanics with a character who has a long sword, you do have to make adjustments for that. I look at a character like Clive in Tekken 8. They specifically stated they had to shorten the length of his sword because he's in a fighting game. And if they kept the actual length of the sword, he would be an insane character who is OP and there's no way you would even get close to him. Which is what you would have to do with Sephiroth in the Masamune. Whether he's in Smash or Kingdom Hearts, you have to adjust the length of the sword, otherwise it would just provide an unfair advantage for the AI or the person controlling the character. But it's also one of the reasons why he's a lot of fun to use in Dissidia, because he has that reach and it's really intimidating, especially if you know how to trigger his cancels, which then allows the character to just rush forward and continue with a new combo in Dissidia. It's very terrifying. But 10 feet being like the ideal base length, again, this sounds very vulgar and kind of sus. I don't mean for it to, it just makes sense. He's an intimidating character. He also needs a weapon that matches up with that. So up next, we get some really interesting info in regards to the organic matter of the Masamune and how it can change its length, which I'm pretty sure a lot of men out there would also like to do. I'm sorry, it's happening. I will stop. They go on to say, do you ever alter the length of the sword in certain scenes, such as lengthening it for visual effect or shortening it to accommodate certain moves? Nomura says, the Masamune's blade has an organic quality to it, lengthening and shortening as needed. In the recently released second season of the First Soldier arc in Ever Crisis, there actually is a scene in which the Masamune grows longer for the first time. I would love for you to check it out. Now, we've been covering the First Soldier, and I don't recall seeing a specific scene where that happens, where the length of the sword changes. So it may have been in some of the combat stuff I missed, or maybe it's something that just hasn't happened yet, because again, Sephiroth hasn't gotten his hands on the sword yet. He's getting close, but he's not there. But him just coming out and saying that, yeah, it has an organic quality to it, it can change its length when it wants to, kind of makes me wonder if the sword has a little bit of a mind of its own that just kind of intrinsically ties into Sephiroth. And again, if we're using that theory of the sword being crafted by a piece of that meteorite from Genova, it would make sense why Sephiroth can wield it the way he does. It's not just because he's a skilled fighter, but he is intrinsically tied to it because of his DNA. So it being able to change its length is pretty cool. And I'm also pretty sure that Sephiroth can just manifest the sword at will. There are so many scenes in Remake and Rebirth, and I don't think this was done on accident or the developers forgot, but there are scenes where Sephiroth shows up to talk to Cloud in the party and he doesn't have the Masamune, but then towards the end of the scene, boom, it's just there. And again, the developers are usually really on top of the details of what happens in the story and the characters, and I think they would catch something like that. So maybe that just kind of speaks to its organic nature. Maybe it can just kind of pop in and out of existence whenever Sephiroth needs it, but it also being tied to Sephiroth makes sense. I look at the final battle in Rebirth and there's a moment where he throws the Masamune into the ground, and I think he does like a whisper attack, and you as the player aren't targeting Sephiroth, you have to target the Masamune, and when you lower its health enough, that's when you break Sephiroth out of his move and stun him. So again, this weapon is tied to Sephiroth in multiple ways, and I can't wait to learn more about how that comes to pass. Up next, the next question. Again, kind of makes me wonder if the interviewer just didn't do any research on Ever Crisis before they interviewed Nomura, because they asked, did someone in the universe of FF7 make this sword especially for Sephiroth? Nomura literally answered that a couple of questions ago by saying it was the medieval blacksmith Masamune. But Nomura goes on to say, I mentioned the first soldier arc in FF7 Ever Crisis a moment ago, but if you look at Season 1, when young Sephiroth first appeared, you will see that he's equipped with a Shinra military sword. That means it won't come as a surprise if other people were also equipped with it. That said, I personally think that a military sword is more of an accessory for ceremonial purposes, and so Sephiroth would probably be the only person who would actually wield it after customizing it to be more suited for combat. Typically, a sword is heavily impacted by the skill of its wielder, and it is prone to become useless unless the wielder has the appropriate prowess, so it is rare for someone to use a sword in combat. Also, in the aforementioned second season of the first soldier arc of Ever Crisis, you will experience the episode in which young Sephiroth obtains the Masamune, as well as meet the blacksmith who created the sword, so we'll be diving deeper into the lore of the Masamune for the first time. The settings and background were brewing in my head, but in order to depict this in the game, I consulted Motomo Toriyama, the co-director of the remake series and director of Ever Crisis, and we decided to ask Kazushige Nojima, scenario writer for the FF7 series, to write this for us. So maybe it's possible that this interview took place before that episode of The First Soldier came out. I will give some leeway to the interviewer. Maybe they just didn't know about it at that point, or maybe they just didn't have time to research. I don't know. But hey, it happens. But that description that Nomura gives, I feel like perfectly kind of describes who Sephiroth is. He's an incredibly skilled, disciplined fighter, and if you give him a standard issue sword, yeah, he's going to want to customize it to his liking, but then he's going to use that sword to do some pretty big devastation. I'm pretty sure you could give Sephiroth a butter knife, and he would find a way to make it the ultimate knife in that universe. That's how good he is. And visually, you see that within his combat style, specifically at the beginning of Rebirth when you get to play the Nibelheim flashback and you get to control Sephiroth. His combo moves are so fast and fluid, and if you actually slow the footage down, the animations on it are beautiful. Like, Sephiroth is just an incredibly prolific fighter. It's almost like a ballet dance with him. He's that good at it. And again, those characters within that world, not everyone is going to wield a sword. Obviously, some of the first class people like Sephiroth, Angeal, Genesis, later on Zack, would use swords, but then you also have characters like Glenn, who uses a big old battle axe hammer thing, and Lucia, who is the gunsmith of the group. And as a kid, my headcanon, when I looked at Sephiroth and I looked at the Masamune and I looked at Cloud with the Buster Sword, I assumed that when you reached first class, you got certain privileges. And that is the case to a degree. First class soldiers can dress how they want, so they get their own uniforms. But I also assumed, oh, maybe Sephiroth just had the Masamune commissioned for him because he also got the opportunity to use his own unique weapon. Turns out that's not the case. He's gonna get it by some crazier, more supernatural means. But learning about the backstory of the Masamune I think is so cool, because now it's going to have its own origin story, its own lineage, which again is going to be a bit twisted when you compare it to the Buster Sword, but we know the history of the Buster Sword being something that was Angeal's weapon, which was a gift from his father, which he passes down to Zack, and then he passes that down to Cloud. So again, when you're looking at the juxtaposition between characters like Cloud and Sephiroth, it's not just who they are as people and what they've been through, but now you're also kind of going deeper by giving giving backstory to their weapons. And I think this is cool. And the fact that Nomura was actively thinking about all of the details of this stuff that you probably don't even need to provide details for, he went and did it anyway because it was brewing around in his head. And turns out it's been really good. Nojima-san in particular has been writing some really great stuff for the First Soldier arc in Ever Crisis. And we're just going to keep learning more in June when the next episode is set to hit. And also, no fears. I know there's been some people saying like, oh man, why are they putting all this stuff in Ever Crisis? Why is it in a mobile game / PC Steam game? What if I don't know any of this stuff when part 3 comes out? Again, I think they'll take anything that's important from Ever Crisis in regards to the story of Sephiroth and Masamune, and they'll just give us the Spark Notes version that we need to know in 7 Remake Part 3, probably at the beginning. So that way it ends up like a crash course on everything you need to know. Boom, you're situated. Now let's move on with the story. And with that, it's the end of the article. And that was a fun little article. You know, cool sword day. I didn't know that was a thing, but you learn something new every day. And just getting Nomura's thoughts on the creation of the character Sephiroth, the Masamune in particular. He put a lot of thought into all of this stuff, and there's clearly a reason for everything, which I appreciate. But with that being said, that's the video. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think of this interview with Tetsuya Nomura from Polygon in regards to the Masamune, its backstory, and some of the stuff they're doing with Ever Crisis. Let me know in the comments down below. I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.